A 2,000-year-old mystery has collided with the quest for the Holy Grail. But what is the real history behind the Da Vinci Code and its provocative portrayal of Jesus Christ's relationship with Mary Magdalene? Now the truth behind the clues hidden in Leonardo da Vinci's masterpiece, The Last Supper. Roses carved in the stone of a Scottish chapel. Medieval knights frozen in effigy. And a tantalizing code embedded in the marble of a Parisian church.
Legend is what is written or told when a story's truth is too dangerous.
What is real and what is not? To find out, we must go back in time beyond the novel, The Da Vinci Code. The year was 1244 AD. Flames singed the calm air of a tiny mountain village in southern France. A funeral pyre blazed as men, women and children were led in solemn procession into the fire. These 13th century villagers were Cathars. In the eyes of the leaders of the medieval Catholic Church, they were vile heretics, to be hunted, besieged, and condemned to death.
The church ordered wholesale extermination of the Cathars. An army of 40,000 men descended on the south of France with a mandate to destroy everything.
Thousands of Cathar souls died for what they believed, and in their eyes became martyrs. This much is verified fact, but some people believe they went to their deaths to keep a secret so dangerous it threatened the very foundations of the church. According to the novel, The Da Vinci Code, the scene of persecution was reenacted many times down the centuries. Even the most high-born in society would submit to death in order to protect the secret from being revealed. But what is this dangerous idea? It's the body of thought that forms the heart of the phenomenal bestseller, The Da Vinci Code, a work that cleverly combines elements of historical fact with fictional events. To separate reality from romance, we must first take a journey through the unorthodox version of history suggested by the book, and then explore which parts are true and which are invention.
None of the material, heretical or orthodox, in the Da Vinci Code is actually new. It's all been around for many centuries in theological works and history works. It's a new 21st century reworking of the Grail theme and some other older themes. This material has caused a lot of us to re-examine what we believe and why.
According to the book, there is a version of history so explosive that it's been hidden for 1,000 years by a secret society. Its heretical truth is so powerful, it has been responsible for the death of kings. The heresy is allegedly encoded in the works of one of the world's greatest artists.
I think the Da Vinci Code is a very important phenomena because it shows that people are open to and looking for, perhaps, an alternative understanding of Christianity.
The Da Vinci Code audaciously rewrites the legend of the Holy Grail and calls into question the accepted foundations of the Catholic Church.
Now we are suddenly fixed with the idea, well, maybe they didn't tell us everything. Suddenly, when we read Dan Brown's book, people are saying, goodness gracious, I wonder what else they forgot to tell us.
Could any of the book's extravagant claims be correct? Is it possible that Leonardo da Vinci covertly painted heretical elements in some of the most famous works of Renaissance art? Is it likely that the true origins of Christianity were obscured or rewritten by the fathers of the early church? And could these churches hold a key to the holy bloodline of Christ?
Most people come to the Da Vinci Code not having heard any of this before. These are very, very powerful and compelling ideas which have certain resonances with historical fact, with new scholarship that's being done, and which most people have not heard. And so they find it shocking, stunning, fascinating to contemplate.
This is a way of writing for a popular kind of audience. But I think it's also important to recognize that this is fiction.
The plot of Dan Brown's novel is based on a story told long before the Da Vinci Code was written. He built on the notion that Mary Magdalene, one of Christ's followers, was also his partner, that she was, furthermore, his wife, who would eventually come to be worshipped alongside him as a goddess.
I believe that Jesus and Mary Magdalene were married, that they were actually partners, that Jesus embodied the archetype of God as bridegroom, and Mary embodied the archetype of God as bride.
That Jesus and Mary Magdalene had an intimate relationship is also a hypothesis found in the historical survey, Holy Blood, Holy Grail.
It is more plausible for a man to have been married, had children, and a claim to a throne than that he had been born of a virgin, walk on water, and rise from the dead.
The Da Vinci Code also makes the claim that Mary was pregnant by Jesus at the time of the crucifixion, and that she was forced to escape from Jerusalem to save both herself and her unborn child. A French legend dating from about 900 AD relates how she fled to Egypt, where her secret was kept safe. She gave birth to a daughter, Sarah, who was the only descendant of Christ and sole heir to his kingdom on earth.
The child's name, Sarah, in Hebrew means princess. So I believe that that child is actually a legendary reference to the bloodline.
This controversial interpretation, however, runs counter to Orthodox Catholic doctrine.
There is no evidence whatsoever for any bloodline stemming from Jesus to the present day. None whatsoever.
Nevertheless, the French legend does exist, and it relates that Sarah and her mother did not stay in Egypt. When she was about 12, Sarah was taken by Mary Magdalene and other disciples of Christ across the Mediterranean to the shores of southern France.
We have a legend that says that Mary Magdalene and her friends in 42 AD showed up on the shores of France in a boat with no oars, and they brought with them the blood royal.
The Da Vinci Code says that many years later, Sarah's descendants married into a French royal family, the Merovingians, which ruled France from 486 to 751 AD.
Is there evidence that suggests a continuation of a bloodline running from Jesus to the Merovingians? Well, yes, possibly. Certainly there is evidence, or what can be construed as evidence, but I must stress that evidence is not proof.
The Merovingians ruled France between the Somme and the Loire for nearly 300 years. But when their power began to wane, according to the Da Vinci Code, a new initiative was needed to keep the bloodline alive.
Modern attempts to address the story have inevitably involved a secret or semi-secret society known as the Prieuré de Sion, Priory of Zion. Certainly such a society existed once upon a time.
The Priory of Sion was formed in 1099. But in the fictional world of the Da Vinci Code, the Priory's main objective was to protect the bloodline of the descendants of Jesus and Mary Magdalene, as spelled out in the Sang Real, or documents of the royal blood. In order to safeguard their charges, the Priory is said to have created one of the most beguiling and possibly subversive organizations in Western history, the Knights Templar.
We see in their eyes the need for, we might call crack security troops. You could think of the Templars as the warrior monks of the Crusades.
The Knights Templar certainly existed. In the novel, the Knights were sent by the Priory of Sion to find the Sang-Real documents in the ruins of Solomon's Temple. The documents allegedly contained a genealogy of the descendants of Jesus.
It is certainly possible that the Templars found something. If they found anything, nobody knows what they might have found.
According to the Da Vinci Code, the documents and the explosive truth they contained were allegedly used by the Templars to blackmail their masters in the church. The Knights rapidly became powerful, rich, and vulnerable. In October 1307, on Friday the 13th, King Philippe launched a surprise attack against all the Templars in France. They were imprisoned. The leaders were tortured and executed. The mass assault caused shockwaves to reverberate throughout Europe.
Today, it would be as though we open up the newspaper and hear that every single executive of a very powerful bank or company, such as IBM, was arrested worldwide at dawn.
Some of the warrior knights escaped and fled, carrying with them, according to the novel, the secrets of the Sang-Real documents. The documents were placed for safekeeping with the Priory of Sion. A thorough search for them was then mounted by the church, which wanted very badly to destroy them. This hunt for the Sang-Real documents became the quest for the Holy Grail.
The main view many of us have of the Holy Grail today is that of a cup or a chalice, particularly, perhaps the cup that held the blood of Christ.
But in the Da Vinci Code, it's Mary Magdalene herself who holds the blood of Christ. Her womb carries his child. She is the Grail. Through the centuries, the Priory of Sion hid this truth from the Catholic Church. The documents that prove the bloodline were handed down from one priory Grand Master to the next. They eventually reached the most famous Grand Master of them all, Leonardo da Vinci, or so the story goes.
Leonardo is a very charismatic figure, a very enigmatic figure. He's an Einstein. He's someone who thinks in brilliant new ways, new brilliant paradigms.
The Da Vinci Code asserts that Leonardo encoded the priory's secret into his work. In The Last Supper, for example, the novel makes the claim that the somewhat feminine figure seated on Jesus' right is not John the Beloved, as is commonly believed. Instead, he is Mary Magdalene.
Da Vinci seems to have known this tradition because he's clearly painted Mary Magdalene with Jesus at the Last Supper, as it should have been, but as it isn't now.
Was Leonardo trying to convey some hermetic knowledge to a wider world? Did he indeed insert cryptic messages into his most famous paintings? Is this the most earth-shaking secret of all time, or is it something else entirely? Evidence abounds, and it starts with some early accounts of Mary Magdalene not found in the Bible, which were buried in the desert for 2,000 years.
The Gospel of Philip says that Jesus often kissed Mary on her, and then there's a blank, a hole in the papyrus.
Christianity as a religion began on a cross 2,000 years ago. It was based on the life and teachings of a man who was worshipped as the Son of God by his followers. But what about the woman in tears at the foot of the cross? She was Mary Magdalene, a sinner and a prostitute. That's the image of her painted by history. But what if this image is wrong? What if her tears were not those of a repentant sinner, but those of a wife weeping for the father of her unborn baby? This is the radical new view of Christianity's origins suggested by the Da Vinci Code.
I believe that Mary Magdalene had a very special relationship with Jesus. In fact, I believe that they modeled partnership for the earliest community of Christians, and that they were actually husband and wife.
This unorthodox view insists that the woman castigated as a prostitute was the person Jesus chose to carry on the faith after his earthly death. After the crucifixion, she fled Jerusalem for another land and gave birth to a daughter, the heir of Christ. This extraordinary alternative version of history has been kept secret for 2 millennia. But where did the idea originate? In 1945, in a remote area in the Egyptian desert, a set of documents was discovered that cast new light on the early years of Christianity. The ancient writings, found near the town of Nag Hammadi, contained information about the religion of Jesus which are not found in the New Testament.
We know that these are authentic documents and real sources that come from very early, from the very first centuries after the death of Jesus.
The texts are collectively called the Gnostic Gospels, and they were written by a Christian sect in the 2nd century AD. They include the Gospel of Philip, the Gospel of Thomas, and the Gospel of Mary, and they record very unconventional accounts of the life of Jesus.
The Gospel of Philip says that Jesus often kissed Mary on her, and then there's a blank, a hole in the papyrus. So we don't know whether he kissed her mouth, her forehead, her cheek, her shoulder. We're not really sure, but we do know that the other apostles were jealous of their intimacy.
The Gnostics who wrote the words were not part of the mainstream. They were mystics on the fringe of the established church. The Da Vinci Code maintains that their works form part of a lost history of Christianity.
The whole of the Christian gnosis is about the revelation of what the Christians called the Christ within, which is that what we really are is not a thing, is not a body, it's that we are awareness.
The notion of finding Christ from within ourselves rather than through the teachings of the church is another concept that distinguishes the Gnostics from other early Christians. And there's more.
We have a kind of idealized reconstruction of Christian origins in which there was some sort of equality between Jesus' disciples, both male and female, in a non-hierarchical, shall we say, more democratic community.
The picture of Mary Magdalene as Christ's equal, his wife and the mother of his child, is not found in the Bible. This view of her, the Da Vinci Code suggests, was censored by the early church and rendered heretical, which is supposedly why the Gnostic Gospels had to be kept hidden. But even in the New Testament accounts, Mary Magdalene emerges as a prominent member of Jesus' entourage.
Mary Magdalene is present during his ministry, during Jesus' crucifixion, and she's the first identified apostle, first identified disciple who has a vision of the resurrected Jesus. What else we know about Mary Magdalene in the New Testament is that she, along with other women, is identified as, if you like, bankrolling the ministry of Jesus.
Mary Magdalene is mentioned in all 4 of the canonical Gospels, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. She's mentioned on 8 separate lists that include other women, and on 7 of those 8 lists, she's mentioned first. So although the scripture never says that she's First Lady, she's the preeminent Mary in the Gospels.
The image with which the Magdalene is most commonly associated is that of the repentant prostitute. In fact, this is a serious misinterpretation.
There's no scriptural evidence that Mary Magdalene was a prostitute. I believe the identification of the woman who anointed Jesus with a sinner, which happens only in Luke's Gospel, was the foundation for this belief, this widespread belief that Mary Magdalene may have been a prostitute.
Luke's text is very clear there was a woman of the city who was a sinner. No name. But tradition wants to supply names. And so in the Western tradition, this figure becomes identified with Mary.
Pope Gregory the Great in the 6th century branded her a prostitute, but not in order to suppress a feminist view of Christianity.
Gregory didn't do it to trash women. Gregory did it to help people realize that even with their sense of sin and worthlessness, that God loved them enough to restore them to grace.
Concerning evidence that the Gnostic Gospels were deliberately hidden or destroyed, at the time they were written, the leaders of the Church had not yet determined the particular texts which would make up the New Testament and become the only acceptable versions. The Gnostic Gospels may not have been hidden at all.
They were lost. They were lost to antiquity. We don't know that they were deliberately hidden. We can't assume that just because they are not included in the canon that somebody was trying to hide them.
The Gnostic Gospels serve as important source material for the Da Vinci Code, but the few references to Mary Magdalene's relationship with Jesus in the New Testament Gospels neither prove nor disprove that they were married or had a child. And even if they did, these ideas wouldn't necessarily have been suppressed.
In the earliest 1st century, we know that it was incumbent on a Jewish father to find a wife for his son before the young man turned 20. There are very few exceptions.
Christ having a family would not necessarily undermine or invalidate his ministry.
It's not important that he is regarded as celibate. It's not important that he is regarded as married. What's important is what model he provides for the way in which God cares about humanity.
If the notion of finding Christ from within, rather than through the Church, was really threatening to the authorities, then the Da Vinci Code's claim of a 2,000-year cover-up appears more plausible. But the central question remains: what if Mary actually was pregnant at the crucifixion? She couldn't remain in Jerusalem with the child of a crucified Messiah. But where could she go? And what would happen to the infant? The quest for the Holy Grail has been the abiding passion of many people down the ages. It's an odd obsession if you consider it to be the search for a mere cup. But the Da Vinci Code suggests the Grail is something much more wonderful than that.
Today, we often think of that as a quest for a material object, like treasure, a chalice, gold, or something like that. But actually, in the medieval versions of the story, it was a quest for something transcendent or spiritual. Something very much beyond our everyday, ordinary world.
We have a symbol of the Holy Grail, which is a chalice or vessel that once contained the blood of Christ. And the vessel is an archetypal symbol for the feminine. The earth as vessel, the mother as vessel, the womb as vessel.
If the hypothesis that underpins the novel is correct, it's the vessel that carries the daughter of Jesus Christ that is the Grail, Mary Magdalene herself. And if she truly carried Christ's child, then the men who crucified Jesus would surely have pursued her too. It was essential that she escape from Jerusalem. But where would she go? Many hints and pointers lie embedded in the legends of the Holy Grail. Grail stories are set everywhere from Palestine to England. But one legend essential to this story describes a pregnant Mary Magdalene, together with the uncle of the Virgin Mary, Joseph of Arimathea, seeking refuge in Egypt.
I think Joseph of Arimathea took Mary Magdalene with him from Jerusalem to Alexandria. That's where her legends and myths go. And they would have found a large quarter in Alexandria of Jewish people where they could have fit it right in.
Once in Egypt, according to the legend, Mary Magdalene gave birth to a daughter, Sarah, and she brought her up there until Sarah was 12. Then, about AD 42, Mary, Sarah, Joseph, with some other people, left Egypt and set sail in a boat with no oars to the marshy shores of Gaul, the Roman province that is now the south of France.
You now have a legend that says that they brought with them the blood royal. Well, you don't carry the blood royal in a jar with a lid. It flows in the veins of a child.
Some traditions trace them to this very part of the coast, near the town of Saint-Marie-de-la-Mer. Here, Mary Magdalene and her daughter lived out the rest of their lives.
What is indisputable fact is that certainly there were Judaic communities scattered around the south of France. And it is certainly likely that any refugee from Palestine at the time would have found refuge amongst some such community.
A fine 9th century church commemorates this Jewish community. It is dedicated to two figures from Scripture, Mary Jacobi, sister of the Virgin Mary, and Mary Salome, the mother of two of the apostles, St. James the Great and St. John. According to legend, both Marys accompanied Joseph of Arimathea and Mary Magdalene to France. And they're depicted here in a boat with no oars. The church also has a shrine dedicated to a figure unique in Christian tradition. The icon of a young, dark-skinned girl stands at the entrance to a crypt. The girl is known as Sarah the Egyptian. Most of the legends that abound in southern France claim that Sarah was a servant girl brought here by Mary Magdalene and her people. But another version insists that Sarah was Mary's daughter, who had been born in Egypt and who was the sole offspring of Jesus Christ. A more familiar journey of the Holy Grail from Jerusalem leads not to France, but to Glastonbury. The ruins of a majestic 12th century abbey still grace this lovely town. Many folk tales hold that this is where Joseph of Arimathea brought the Grail for safekeeping. Could Mary and Sarah have visited here?
By the mid-14th century, the abbot there, John of Glastonbury, then brought in the actual Grail romance material about Joseph of Arimathea and Glastonbury's site into the story. And certainly it wasn't until the late 15th century that the monks of Glastonbury Abbey themselves actually began to promulgate that story.
Looming Glastonbury Tor now guards what the legend maintains is the entrance to the underworld and the place where Joseph of Arimathea buried the Grail. There, a spring immediately began to flow out of the ground. Its curiously red-hued water was emblematic of the blood of Christ spilling from the sacred cup. The water still flows from what is now the Chalice Well. Believers from all over the world visit the well, seeking the water's reputed supernatural healing properties. Whether the Grail arrived in England or in France, as suggested in the Da Vinci Code, is a matter of passionate debate among Grail theorists. But an increasing number of scholars are beginning to study Mary Magdalene herself. Is the Mona Lisa smiling, because she knows a secret about Mary that we don't. The Da Vinci Code proposes that indications of Leonardo's heretical beliefs can be found in some of his most illustrious works. Is the Mona Lisa smiling because she knows something about Mary Magdalene? Is the fourth of the great archangels, Uriel, threatening the Virgin Mary in his painting, The Madonna of the Rocks? Dan Brown contends that Leonardo and other artists held heretical views that they were unable to express in public for fear of religious reprisals. Their belief in the sacred feminine, the divine generative power of woman, is at the core of his novel. According to the Da Vinci Code, Leonardo's work is peppered with indications of hermetic knowledge of Mary Magdalene, and they demonstrate that he was trying to keep alive legends that had been forced underground by the Catholic authorities.
Legend is what is written or told when a story's truth is too dangerous. So it's very possible that legends hold kernels and fossils of truth. I believe that the sacred union of Christ and Mary Magdalene was at the very heart of the Christian story, and that it was sadly, even tragically, lost in the early dawn of the Christian experience and written out of the story.
Some scholars think that the worship of Mary Magdalene was forced underground in the year 325 AD at the Council of Nicaea. This was a conference of all the bishops of the church, convened by the Roman Emperor, Constantine.
At the Council of Nicaea, Constantine's agenda is to form a coherent and simple form of Christianity to which all these different warring bishops can sign up. They all have different opinions about everything. He wants one church, one empire, one emperor. And the basic deal is, you come to Nicaea, you sign up to the creed, you get to stay at a long party at the emperor's expense. You don't sign up, you get exiled from the empire, which pretty much means death in the ancient world.
A clash between conflicting groups was inevitable. The mainstream church fixed its sights on the Gnostics and condemned their beliefs and practices as heretical.
And the religion starts becoming very male, and traces of the impulse towards the sacred feminine start being eradicated in various ways, including what is declared to be heretical thoughts and what is adopted as official text for the New Testament.
The notions that Mary Magdalene gave birth to a daughter and that there were descendants of Jesus still living in 325 AD came in for particular condemnation. Constantine had the Gnostic Gospels destroyed, which left only the texts now found in the New Testament of the Bible, or so says the novel.
The truth about Christian origins is lost because there's only one history which is allowed to survive, and it's written by Bishop Eusebius, who is Constantine's spin doctor, his propagandist.
Did the Council of Nicaea rewrite Christian history, or are adherents of Dan Brown's book attempting to do just that?
There are no discussions in the deliberations of the Christian councils about including or excluding books that specifically identify the non-canonical texts we have today from the Nag Hammadi Library in English.
The writings unearthed at Nag Hammadi, including the Gospels of Philip, of Thomas, and of Mary, are extremely unorthodox accounts of the life of Jesus. But according to religious historians, there was no debate at the Council of Nicaea about censoring any of those texts, or selecting the books that would collectively become the official version of the Catholic faith in the New Testament of the Bible.
The decision about what got included or excluded or regarded as suspicious, three categories of whether material could be in or out of the canon, was not established until the end of the 3rd, beginning of the 4th century. What we do not have is anybody saying, the Gospel of Thomas, out.
The canon evolved over several centuries, and the 27 books that make up the New Testament were not compiled until 42 years after the Council of Nicaea. The assertion that other records of Christianity's origins were destroyed in this period is a great overstatement. Book burnings did occur, but centuries later, and for different reasons. The theory explored in the Da Vinci Code that the Church was determined to quash the Marian legend has found support from those who cite its links with Egyptian myths. According to this hypothesis, the early Church was anxious to erase from its ceremonies and doctrine anything that connected the New Testament story to paganism.
Their dying and resurrecting God-man is Osiris, who dies, comes back to life, ascends to heaven, and is the judge of the quick and the dead. And his consort, his goddess figure, is Isis. And it arises in Christianity as Jesus, who dies and resurrects, and his consort, who's Mary Magdalene.
Christ and Magdalene, in the eyes of the early community, may have been a re-embodiment of that same principle of the sacred union embodied in the Isis-Osiris myth.
The Da Vinci Code suggests that in the eyes of the Catholic Church, a faith based on this sacred union was too similar to the pagan belief systems it was attempting to supplant. Therefore, ceremonies that celebrated the sexual union between deities had to be stopped. Traditional Christian scholars argue that seeing Mary Magdalene as a goddess goes beyond what the sources actually say.
There's nothing that really connects the goddess traditions of Isis with Mary Magdalene. Mary Magdalene isn't a goddess in Christian tradition. You could read in texts about the wisdom figure. You could read in texts about Isis and so on. But then you're going beyond the text. You're creating something in the image that you want.
In fact, Mary Magdalene was made a saint, which was hardly something the Church would do if it wanted to vilify her or erase her from the record. And in 1969, Rome officially cleared Mary Magdalene of the charge of prostitution. Yet the legends that underpin the Da Vinci Code hold that Mary's true legacy had to be extinguished by the Church to prevent her descendants from challenging its authority to govern the Christian world. Those descendants are said to have kept alive Christ's bloodline by marrying into a dynasty of French monarchs, the Merovingians. These Dark Age rulers had bizarre and wondrous tales told about them. A century ago, in the isolated village of Rennes-le-Château, high up in the Pyrenees of southern France, Father Béranger Saunière, a modest rural priest and namesake of the murdered curator of the Louvre in the Da Vinci Code, Jacques Saunière, carried out major renovation work on his church. The work gave rise to an extraordinary story, which has been made famous by the novel. It was no ordinary refurbishment. Saunière installed a number of features that could possibly be considered heretical. Next to the main door of the church, he installed a demonic figure supporting a fountain. A relief carving depicts Christ's body being removed from the tomb under cover of night, instead of being resurrected. Also, Saunière constructed a tower dedicated to Mary Magdalene and commemorates her washing Christ's feet with her long tresses and anointing them with costly lotions. The story relates that during the renovation work, a Visigoth column was removed from its foundation, and inside, Saunière allegedly made an astonishing discovery. He found an assortment of old papers that told a story, a 2,000-year-old saga that completely rewrote the history of Christianity and threatened the legitimacy of the Church, to which he had dedicated his whole life. These writings, the Dossier Secret, document a sacred bloodline that travels back in history from the present day to a dynasty of medieval French kings, monarchs who were themselves true descendants of Jesus Christ. Saunière's story is detailed in the best-selling book of 1982, Holy Blood, Holy Grail, which first brought these ideas to a mass audience.
All we attempted to do was ask the question, is it plausible? Is it plausible that Jesus could have been married, that he could have had a bloodline or children? Is it plausible that those children could have intermarried to produce a Merovingian dynasty? Our conclusions were simply that, yes, these things are plausible.
We have the legend of the Holy Grail, that Mary Magdalene and her friends brought the Holy Grail to France. And we surmise that that Holy Grail is a child of the sacred bloodline, the royal blood of Israel, of King David and of Jesus.
In the Da Vinci Code, that child's descendants married into the dynasty of French kings, the Merovingians, who ruled in the 5th, 6th, and 7th centuries, and who became the heroes of fantastic tales.
The Merovingians were credited with the capacity to heal by the laying on of hands, and the capacity to speak to beasts, to enjoy a kind of clairvoyant rapport with the natural world.
Despite such apparent advantages, the rule of the Merovingians did not last long. By the year 751 AD, the dynasty came to an end. The last of the Merovingians was Dagobert II, who, according to tradition, married a Visigoth princess. He reigned for only 3 years. The king's death came abruptly while he was out on a hunting expedition.
According to the legends, he was asleep under a tree in the Ardennes forest and was killed by a lance through the eye. There is some evidence, not proof, evidence that the church colludes in the assassination of Dagobert II.
The story was supposedly recorded in the Dossier Secret, allegedly found in the Visigoth column at Rennes-le-Château, and echoed in the novel The Da Vinci Code. But in truth, the connection between Jesus and Dagobert, the last of the Merovingians, has not been conclusively proved.
I don't know of any proof that the bloodline actually survived into the Merovingian times. All we have is legends, and the genealogies don't always hold up through the Dark Ages.
Dagobert himself certainly existed, but there's no absolute proof he was a member of a sacred lineage, and other accounts of his death say he was the victim of a rival clan, not an assassin hired by the Pope. Furthermore, the Visigoth column that was moved during Saunier's restoration work doesn't have a hollow space large enough to accommodate bulky documents. But tales of Christ's blood descendants don't stop here. According to the Da Vinci Code, there is another set of much older documents that contain a complete genealogy reaching all the way back to Jesus and Mary Magdalene. Ancient writings called the Saint Graal documents. Saint Graal is a medieval word referring to the Holy Grail.
When the Grail is first mentioned, it is cited as one word, Saint Graal. Somebody back in the Middle Ages arbitrarily broke it after the N and before the G, and the result was Saint Graal, Sainted Grail. If, however, you break the word Saint Graal a letter later after the G, you come up with Sang Graal or Sang Real, blood royal. Could we be talking about a bloodline descended from Jesus?
The Saint Graal documents move the story on from France to Jerusalem and to the ruins of Solomon's Temple, where the Da Vinci Code claims these ancient scrolls were hidden.
In order to rouse the populace and get the Crusades launched, this idea was spread that we were going to send our troops into the Holy Land and we were going to find the relics, including the Holy Grail.
The leader of the First Crusade, Godefroy de Bouillon, is of Merovingian descent. If you trace his pedigree or his genealogy back, you will find that he is indeed descended from the Merovingians.
History records that in July 1099, the Crusaders defeated the Turks, and a triumphant Godefroy de Bouillon was crowned King of Jerusalem. According to Dan Brown's book, soon afterwards, he established the Priory of Sion, a secret society which protected the sanctity of the bloodline for the next 10 centuries.
There is documented proof that in 1099, when Jerusalem was captured by the Crusaders, a group of religious initiates were installed in an abbey on top of Mount Zion and became an order, the Order of Zion.
A medieval priory of Sion did exist, in fact, but in the novel, it was entrusted with a special covert mission to acquire the Saint Graal documents. In order to retrieve the documents from Jerusalem, the novel claims that the priory established a military unit, an order of poor knights called the Knights Templar. The Templars are a well-known phenomenon in medieval history. Originally established to protect European pilgrims traveling to Jerusalem during the Crusades, they made their headquarters in the ruins of Solomon's Temple, from which they got their name.
The Knights Templar occupy the Temple Mount. This is a historical fact. The Knights Templar occupied the Temple of Solomon for 9 years or 11 years, depending on which account you believe. And then the Knights Templar become incredibly powerful. And Dan Brown alleges that they become powerful because they find this secret knowledge.
Exploring the dim recesses of Jerusalem's most venerated shrine, they came upon what the novel claims are the most important writings in Christendom, the Saint Graal documents. The documentary proof of an unbroken bloodline, descending through the kings of the Merovingian dynasty and reaching all the way back to Sarah, the daughter of Jesus Christ. It was for this reason, says the novel, that the fortunes of the poor knights changed suddenly, because they could and did use the secret lineage to blackmail the church.
They had amassed a great deal of money. They were the wealthiest institution in Christendom at the time.
The Templar organization was also very secretive, and because of this, it was controversial and held in suspicion. Rumors about Templar knights indulging in perverse, blasphemous practices were widespread.
It was alleged that they had rituals involving trampling on the cross and repudiating Jesus. It was alleged that they were guilty of sodomy. It was alleged that they were guilty of rape.
Their enemies went so far as to allege that they ceremonially worshipped the severed head of John the Baptist, because he was the original teacher of Christ. No matter how fantastic and ludicrous the charges, there were always some people ready to believe them. While the Templars were loyal and heroic in many respects, the fatal combination of prodigious wealth and extreme secrecy made them potential targets of both the French monarchy and the Catholic hierarchy.
We see a collusion between King Philippe IV of France at the time and Pope Clement V. They both were threatened by what we might call a growing power block of the Knights Templar.
On Friday, 13th of October, 1307, and this is why Friday the 13th is deemed unlucky, acting on secret orders from King Philippe, his seneschals, marshals, servitors descended on all Templar installations in France and arrested every knight they could.
The records reveal in grim detail how they were rounded up, tortured, and executed. The tragic demise of the Templar Order is true. Most of the accusations against individual knights were completely false.
We know many of the charges were certainly exaggerated. They were not found guilty as charged, but rather the Pope decided that the charges were what they now call the verdict of not proven. They were not proven charges, as opposed to guilty per se.
Does the archaeological evidence bear out their finding any scrolls in the temple?
There have been a few artifacts found, mainly spurs of horses and a few remnants of swords, but that is not the same as a cache of treasure or gold or scrolls.
Nor did the Templars' massive wealth come from blackmailing the Pope. It came from popular support and donations.
They were given land by nobles all throughout Europe and elsewhere. And the Knights Templar can be said to have established Western Europe's first multinational corporate banking system in medieval times. After a while, the assets were very considerable.
The original mission of the Knights Templar was to protect Christian pilgrims from bandits on the roads to and from Jerusalem. But by 1312, the Holy Land had reverted to Muslim control, and so that is the reason they were disbanded in that year. The question of whether or not the Templars were established by a priory of Sion must also be addressed.
There is no documentable historical evidence at all that there is any connection between the medieval order of the Knights Templar and what has been called the Priory of Sion.
But the history of the Templars is so cloaked in mystery and conjecture, it leaves plenty of room to speculate on the reasons the order was formed, why they were so viciously attacked, and if the Da Vinci Code is to be believed, how some of them may have escaped from Jerusalem with the Sangral documents. Back to Europe they raced with the documents that would eventually become immortalized as the Holy Grail, and which would be concealed for safekeeping by the Priory of Sion. Once safe, the extraordinary story would be silently preserved for a moment far off in the future when the truth could finally be exposed to a waiting world. Through the dark centuries, the secret would be handed from one Grand Master of the Priory to the next, and if the tale is true, among that clandestine brotherhood was one of the most brilliant men who ever lived.
I went to my art books in the middle of the night and looked at the Last Supper again. I said, oh my, that is a woman in the painting.
There are many theories of what the Holy Grail actually is. The cup that Christ blessed during the Last Supper. The chalice that held his blood at the crucifixion. Perhaps the person of Mary Magdalene herself. Or is it, as the Da Vinci Code suggests, the Sangral documents which preserve the genealogy of Christ's family tree? If the Knights Templar really did find these documents in Jerusalem and escape with them to Europe, then what became of them afterwards? And how could this record of the offspring of Jesus and Mary Magdalene endure in complete secrecy throughout the Middle Ages and beyond? The Templars supposedly took the documents to their masters at the Priory of Sion, guardians of the secret of the bloodline, who hid them because they were heretical and would attract the unwelcome attentions of the papacy. But if legend is to be believed, the members of the Priory were not alone in their unorthodox thinking. In the 12th and 13th centuries, whole communities of people holding heretical views flourished throughout the south of France. They were called Cathars, and their convictions were vehemently opposed by the Church. The Cathars do not feature in the Da Vinci Code, but they are discussed in Holy Blood, Holy Grail, a non-fiction investigation into much of the Hermetic history later incorporated into the novel by Dan Brown.
They regarded women as equal, did not differentiate between the sexes. Cathar preachers could be women as well as men.
Cathars used caves as places of worship, where they nurtured a philosophy that included equality of the sexes. This would have been seen at the time as sinful and heretical. In a cavern near the city of Foix, Cathars are said to have worshipped before this indentation in the rock wall, in which is inscribed a pentagon, and inside it a star. This is a pentacle, the geometric shape the Da Vinci Code claims is a symbol of the sacred feminine. However, such heretical ideas were only part of the reason why the Church persecuted the Cathars.
The Cathars were preaching against the transgressions of the Church, the opulence of the Church, the inequities of the Church, the extent to which Church figures lived in luxury and opulence while the peasantry starved.
Above this, there was a legend that the Cathars were keepers of a fabulous treasure, though no one was sure what it was. Could it have been the Sangral? Whatever it was, the Cathars certainly attracted the wrath of the monarchy and of the Church, which led to the formation of the Inquisition, and in 1209 resulted in the Albigensian Crusade.
The Inquisition was created specifically to combat the Cathar heresy. There was no Inquisition prior to the Albigensian Crusade. It was the first crusade to occur in Europe, on European soil, as opposed to the Holy Land. It was also the first crusade to be waged by Christians against other Christians.
An inquisition was used against the heretics in 1184. When it proved ineffective, the Albigensian Crusade was led against them by the elder Simon de Montfort. The violence continued for 4 decades as Cathar villages were attacked throughout southern France. Thousands were killed. In 1244, one of the last attacks took place at this mountaintop fortress of Montségur. The Crusaders laid siege to the remote monastery and all the villagers sheltering inside it for 10 cruel months. Eventually, inevitably, the attackers prevailed.
Eventually, Montségur fell, and the Cathar defenders voluntarily, rather than convert to Catholicism, voluntarily walked into the flames, allowed themselves to be burned.
One of the motives for the attacks on the Cathars by the French monarchy was to seize their property. Heresy was an excuse for theft on a grand scale. A contemporary French folktale tells how the day before the fall of Montségur, 4 monks escaped down the sheer cliff face, carrying a mysterious Cathar treasure.
Given the sheer nature of the cliff, there's no way they could be carrying vast quantities of gold, for example. Whatever they were carrying must have been relatively portable.
It might perhaps have been the Saint-Graal documents, which threatened the authority of the papacy and the French throne. But this is speculation. However, if it's true, the scrolls and the bloodline they documented were once again moved across Europe and hidden from the ecclesiastical authorities. Transferred from place to place by the Priory of Sion, they were passed down from one generation of Grand Masters to the next, until they reached the most famous Grand Master of all. He was a Florentine artist who embodied the essential spirit of freedom of thought, independent of all religious dogma.
Leonardo is a very charismatic figure, a very enigmatic figure. I think the word enigma is there immediately when you think of Leonardo.
The sublime fusion of art with science typifies the Renaissance, and especially the works of Leonardo da Vinci. But according to the novel, among his special interests was Mary Magdalene and the sacred feminine. These fascinations he allegedly encoded in his paintings and frescoes.
I think he had a lot of hidden thoughts and secret thoughts, and I think some of them may be expressed in his paintings.
The most notable example of Leonardo's hidden thoughts is found in The Last Supper. The most well-known Grail legend holds that the Holy Grail was the cup that Christ drank from and blessed at the meal, saying, "This is my blood." Yet there is no sign of it in the painting. Or is there?
When I was reading the Da Vinci Code for the first time and came to the passage explaining that it's a woman in the painting, I went to my art books in the middle of the night and looked at the Last Supper again. I said, oh my, that is a woman in the painting. How come I've never noticed that?
If you look at the painting of the Last Supper, it really does look like the figure that should be John is actually Mary.
According to the Da Vinci Code, this figure is not John the Evangelist, but Mary Magdalene herself, the Holy Grail. Both she and Jesus are seated side by side at the center of the picture, suggesting their closeness and equality. A disembodied dagger hovers to one side. This may represent the hostility some of the apostles felt because of Mary's importance to Jesus. There's also Peter's hand slicing through the air in a menacing gesture, perhaps expressing his jealousy of Mary and her role as Christ's consort. And in the middle of the entire composition is a large V shape, the symbol that allegedly connects veneration of the female with the Holy Grail and Mary Magdalene.
We know that the Grail is supposed to have been a vessel. And one of the ancient symbols for the feminine is the vessel, the V shape, is the cup or the chalice, the womb, the vessel of life. It's the pubic triangle, if you will.
Like the pentacle, V is understood as a symbol of female deity. But is any of this encoded symbolism credible?
Leonardo da Vinci, like all artists, introduced symbols into his artwork so that audiences would recognize the visual meaning. But there were not heretical symbols put secretly into the work of art. In the Renaissance, there are a number of Last Suppers painted. We have many examples of them. John the Evangelist is always next to Christ. John the Evangelist is always feminine looking. He has long hair, he has a very beautiful face, and in no way can this be conceived as a hidden Mary Magdalene. The dagger on the left of the painting of Leonardo's Last Supper is the dagger of St. Bartholomew, one of the 12 disciples, who was flayed when he was martyred.
The V shape, symbolizing the cup and the womb and the sacred feminine, is a principal contention of the Da Vinci Code.
Why does V represent the sacred feminine? That is a concoction. That is not a theory that has any sort of legitimacy. V is not a symbol of the sacred feminine. Leonardo always made a dynamic composition. The V shape of the left-hand portion is really for a dramatic effect. It has nothing to do with the sacred feminine.
But if the feminine figure is John, and the V shape has no connection to the Grail or the sacred feminine, why does the Last Supper have no chalice in the picture at all?
The Holy Grail is more about Arthurian legend, King Arthur, and the English literary tradition, and it's more about 19th century Romanticism than it is about the Renaissance.
Lastly, there is no evidence that Leonardo belonged to the Priory of Sion, as he does in the novel.
The idea that Leonardo da Vinci would have been a Grand Master of the Priory of Sion, I think, is impossible. Leonardo was a loner. He was interested in his own thoughts and his own ideas.
In Leonardo's 15 or so manuscripts, thousands and thousands of lines, there's no evidence for any involvement of Leonardo da Vinci in any secret religious organizations of the 15th and 16th century.
In the Da Vinci Code, the art of Leonardo contains indications of the heretical ideas that Jesus and Mary Magdalene were husband and wife, that they spawned a bloodline which was recorded in the Sang Real documents, that the documents were found by the Templar Knights, who escaped both the clutches of the Catholic Church and the French monarchy. But if they were forced to flee France, where might the Templars take the documents?
There were many other countries, of course, where there were Templars. Italy, Spain, parts of England.
In the novel, the refuge is here, the Temple Church in London, which was actually built by the order and consecrated in 1185 by Heraclius, the Patriarch of Jerusalem. The building is in two distinct parts, the round church and the chancel. This is a long traditional nave, bounded by an altar and graced with a stained glass window depicting the essential motif of the Templars: two poor knights riding one horse. But at the other end, the round church is a lofty chamber where the life-size effigies of 9 knights, all supporters and patrons of the Templars, lie portentously carved in Purbeck marble on the floor. They are stared at by gargoyles with ghastly faces. truly the stuff of medieval nightmares. The round church is one of only 3 circular churches in Britain, and the Da Vinci Code suggests it is a pagan temple in which sexual rites celebrating the union of Jesus and Mary Magdalene might have been performed. The round church in reality was designed to recall the holiest place in the Crusaders' world, the Church of the Holy Sepulchre in Jerusalem. Perhaps surviving Templar refugees from France did find safety here. But is the church's circularity really evidence of such dark intrigue?
It's possibly more likely that the round design aspect came from the Church of the Holy Sepulchre, because that is what the medieval Templars said they were sworn to defend.
In the novel, the Sangreal documents were kept in the temple church for only 1 night. Then they were taken north to another, even more remote hiding place, in Scotland. Outside Edinburgh is another extraordinary church. It is thought to have been built by the Templars between 1446 and 1486. It is in reality called Roslin Chapel. It is referred to in the novel as the Cathedral of Codes.
Roslin Chapel is not a cathedral. It was originally meant to be part of a much larger cathedral. However, it does have many very fascinating carvings, but from a variety of traditions: the Christian, the Jewish, the Pythagorean, the Rosicrucian, and other esoteric traditions.
The Da Vinci Code claims the carvings in the chapel are clues that tie together all the groups associated with the blood descendants of Jesus.
Roslin Chapel was built under the auspices of a family called the St. Clairs, particular Sir William Sinclair.
William was allegedly descended from the Merovingians, the French dynasty said to carry the bloodline. And this stone inscription states that St. Clair was also a Templar knight. Finally, he's linked to the Priory of Sion because in the novel, the St. Clairs are listed among the Priory's first Grand Masters. Thus, Roslin links the Merovingians with the Templars, with the Priory. Many scholars regard this as pure conjecture.
There is no connection at all between the medieval Knights Templar and the St. Clair family of Roslin. There are what some believe to be Templar-related carving, which was used on the medieval Templars' official seal. But because that carving is similar, it does not mean that the Templars built Roslin Chapel.
But there are other intriguing symbols found at Roslin, including the pentacle and the rose. These in the Da Vinci Code are symbols associated with both the sacred feminine and the priory.
On the ceiling, there is a 5-pointed star. And next to that on the roof, we will see a panel of roses.
The rose allegedly gave Roslin its name because the chapel sits on the meridian called the Rose Line. The novel identifies the Rose Line as the original prime meridian, the geographical marker of time zones, before it was moved to its present location in Greenwich. The Rose Line also runs through another landmark in the novel, the Pyramid at the Louvre Museum in Paris. The pyramid is where the plot begins, and of course, the pyramid is also redolent of Egypt, the land where Mary Magdalene gave birth to Sarah, daughter of Jesus. The Rose Line is also said to run through another Paris monument, the Church of Saint-Sulpice. At first, this massive classical building has the appearance of a traditional church. It was begun in 1645 and took 135 years to construct, although it is still unfinished. Saint-Sulpice possesses curious characteristics. A stained glass window bears the letters P and S. Could they stand for Priory of Sion? On one side of the nave is an obelisk, again, an emblem of Egypt. Running down the center of the obelisk and across the floor is a brass line. According to the Da Vinci Code, it marks the Rose Line. From Paris to Scotland, the Rose Line connects a continent-wide conspiracy to preserve the truth of the sacred bloodline. But it turns out there may be less here than meets the eye. According to the church authorities, the P and S in the stained glass window stand for Saints Peter and Sulpice, not Priory of Sion. And the brass line running through the obelisk and across the floor is simply an astronomical sun marker. It doesn't coincide with the meridian running through Paris, and it has never been called the Rose Line. In fact, the prime meridian doesn't run from Saint-Sulpice to Roslin at all.
The name Roslin is not known for certain. There have been many theories put forth, but Roslin Chapel does not derive its name from the Rose Line.
Regarding some of the other coded symbols in Roslin Chapel, there is no consensus that the five-pointed star is a symbol of the sacred feminine.
I have nowhere found it signifying the feminine any more than it signifies numerous other things. To find a pentagram or pentacles somewhere and say, ah, that is the sacred feminine, is nonsense.
Nor is there evidence that a secret priory of Sion is symbolized by the rose. Further, it appears that the grave slab in the chapel tying Roslin's founder to the Templars was not found at Roslin and doesn't refer to its founder. All of this would seem to undo the story of a grand conspiracy to preserve a sacred bloodline. But there are some carvings at Roslin that linger in the mind as unexplained. This column, called the Apprentice Column, for example, and this crouching angel. They are both acknowledged to be Masonic symbols. Significantly, the St. Clairs were members of a Scottish Masonic order. Masonry began as a guild of medieval stonemasons, builders of castles and cathedrals. But at some point, they claimed their society harked back to the ancient builders of Solomon's Temple, and this connected them to the Knights Templar. It was a mythic link that would have dramatic consequences. By the 1700s, they had evolved into a discreet and highly influential society, which advocated progressive philosophical notions like democracy and secular government. These ideas understandably didn't impress the autocratic Louis XVI, King of France. When the French Revolution of 1789 overthrew the monarchy, some people at the time blamed the revolution on a Masonic conspiracy to avenge the death of their forebears, the Templars, who were ancestral enemies of the French crown.
Was this a conspiracy? Was it a conspiracy in France? If you were a rationalist and a free thinker in that time period, you would have favored the end of monarchy, you would have favored democracy, and you wouldn't have needed to be a secret conspiracy to believe these things. It was not a conspiracy.
This theory is merely the latest in a long line of unproven claims. The Masons are not linked to the Templars. The Knights Templar were not created by the Priory of Sion. The Priory did not protect a sacred bloodline, and there is no proof that the Sangreal documents ever existed. So how did this incredible 2,000-year-old saga start and finally end up in a best-selling novel? In fact, there is a secret story behind the Da Vinci Code. It's not the one everyone talks about, but it does start at the same place where the novel begins, with Father Béranger Saunière and the mystery of Rennes-le-Château.
We were confronted by a group of people in Paris with a seemingly bizarre, bonkers objective, namely to restore 1600 years.
The genius of the Da Vinci Code is the brilliance with which it weaves together history, legend, and fantasy into a fascinating new tapestry.
My view of Dan Brown and of the story told in the Da Vinci Code is the further he goes back in history, the more reasonable and interesting his ideas are. The more he goes up to the recent times, the more decoupled from real scholarship and academic thinking he becomes.
A case in point is Father Bérenger Saunier's alleged discovery of the dossier secret. The dossier secret is pivotal to the narrative. But if Saunier did not actually find the documents in his church, where did they originate? They can be traced to a different source, a more modern source, and one that seems today highly questionable. The dossier secret files were first brought to public attention when in 1956, a French newspaper, Dépêche du Midi, published articles about them after they came to light in the French National Library in Paris. Who wrote them? Who placed them in the library and why? It transpires they were placed there by a group that registered with the French government in 1956, a group calling itself the Priory of Sion. It was a wholly modern organization whose Grand Master was a man named Pierre Plantard.
Plantard developed a myth whereby he was the only one who could save France during the war and after the war, saying that he was part of a secret society.
It was his group that produced the dossier secret.
They consist, for the most part, of page after page after page of genealogy. You go through them and you wonder what the devil is all this in name of. What is it trying to prove? So bloody what?
These documents try to prove through a series of stories that there's indeed a descendant of the Merovingians who is a lost king. In the first interview I did with him, I asked Plantard, "What do you think of the story of the lost king?" And Plantard answered, "The lost king is not as far away as you think."
I think Plantard and his circle were right-wing intellectuals and French nationalists who were trying to create a modern myth by using history and bits and pieces of facts and legends. It's completely clear to me that their creation of the Priory of Sion as a modern organization, their writing of these secret dossiers, their spinning of this myth of the Priory of Sion and this whole legend was an intentional act.
Nevertheless, the documents kindled the interest of investigators like Richard Lee, who were intrigued by the idea of an ancient Priory of Sion. Old land transfer documents show there was a medieval priory, but it was a rather unremarkable Catholic order, and it didn't last very long.
We were able to trace references to the Priory de Sion up until 1619. In 1619, we found a reference to the effect that their premises at the priory in Orléans was turned over to the Jesuits, and they were booted out. After that, we found no subsequent references to them until 1956.
The investigation resulted in the publication of Holy Blood, Holy Grail in 1982.
We were confronted by a group of people in Paris with a seemingly bizarre, bonkers objective, namely to restore a 1600-year-old bloodline.
But Lee and his co-authors also added another element. They linked the Merovingians to Jesus and Mary Magdalene.
Our conclusions were simply that, yes, these things are plausible. I can't say, nor will my co-authors say, that we believe them. We will certainly not argue that this was the case.
The speculative history of Holy Blood, Holy Grail was ingeniously incorporated into the fiction of the Da Vinci Code. New elements like the concept of the sacred feminine and coded messages in Leonardo's paintings were added. a phenomenon was born. It all makes for a great novel, but in France, where much of the story takes place, the authentic history is well known, and very few of the ideas in the Da Vinci Code are taken as fact.
From the very beginning, and we're talking 30 years ago, everyone in France knew this was a hoax.
Hoax or not, there's one final chapter of the Da Vinci Code to explore. It is one that goes beyond the pages of the book.
Opus Dei means work of God, and the aim of Opus Dei is to spread the message that everybody is called to holiness.
But is there more to Opus Dei than the call to spirituality? The Da Vinci Code is a narrative overflowing with tantalizing clues. It begins with the death of a museum curator, splayed out like Leonardo's Vitruvian Man on the floor of the Louvre in Paris. This, the first of many leads, takes the action to a temple in London, where 9 knights who protect a sacred genealogy lie in marble effigy. The story then travels to a church in Paris, where a monument indicates that a daughter of Jesus was born in Egypt and that she produced descendants. Then to a chapel in Scotland, containing iconographic pointers to an old conspiracy dedicated to preserving the bloodline of those descendants. And finally, to a secretive cult that intends to finally reveal the shocking truth to the world. All the clues tend to lead us into blind alleys. In the novel, the actions of the Priory of Sion force the hand of a conservative religious group that seeks to suppress all knowledge of the bloodline. But this group does exist outside the pages of the novel.
Opus Dei is an organization of the Catholic Church, and its name is Latin, and Opus Dei means work of God. And the aim of Opus Dei is to spread the message that everybody is called to holiness, and they achieve holiness through their ordinary work and the duties of every day. The portrayal of Opus Dei is very inaccurate. It portrays Opus Dei as praying all day, as wearing monkish cowls, and generally engaged in conspiracy theories. We go to Mass every day, and we spend perhaps an hour in prayer every day, but almost all the time we're in our homes, or we are working just like everybody else.
Opus Dei has offices in London and New York. The organization is growing rapidly and currently has some 80,000 members. It is regarded by many people as one of the most conservative groups in the Catholic world.
It's a personal prelature of the Pope, meaning that it exists within the Catholic Church, but separate from the normal structure.
Opus Dei was established in 1928 by Father José María Escrivá de Balaguer. Its stated objective is to contribute to the evangelizing mission of the Catholic Church and help people practice the lessons of the gospel in everyday life. Its supporters assert that Opus Dei stands for traditional values, but detractors accuse its members of extremist views and questionable practices. The Da Vinci Code refers to one in particular.
The book makes the allegation that the Vatican entered into a kind of corrupt bargain with Opus Dei, that Opus Dei lent the Vatican some money. This is a very damaging allegation, and it's quite the most outrageous thing in the book, and it is completely false.
It is also claimed that the group performs medieval rites, such as administering pain as a means to salvation. Opus Dei does practice self-mortification, although in a mild form.
Some members use the cilice some of the time, and that's a kind of band made of wire that goes around the leg. The idea is that if you practice small mortifications, When the hour of temptation comes, you'll have moral fibre, moral backbone, and you'll avoid being a kind of jellyfish and caving in. It's not something exclusive to Opus Dei.
Whatever one thinks of the methods of Opus Dei, one thing is clear. It never had a mission to eradicate the bloodline of Christ from history, because Opus Dei does not believe such a bloodline exists. For its part, Opus Dei has no interest in the Da Vinci Code's grand fictional conspiracy, but the international success of Dan Brown's book shows that the novel has struck a resounding chord with contemporary readers, and there are plenty of theories as to why this should be.
The possibility that things may be happening in the world around us over which we have no control is disturbing. Conspiracy theories are comforting. They suggest a human agency is at work. You've got somebody to blame or somebody to join.
I think many people today are attempting to link back to an earlier tradition or get to the roots of the truth. And so this is a thriller novel that has actually been a profound catalyst.
What it shows, its popularity shows, is that people are open to and looking for a new interpretation of Christianity.
The book, although it is allegedly based on historical fact, is entirely fictive. It represents what might be still to be experienced or to be found or discovered. So it represents a sort of eternal quest.
In the final analysis, Dan Brown's book appears to raise many questions, but tends to leave the possible answers to the imagination of the reader.
When you really analyze even the Da Vinci Code as literary text, we're not clear. Is he telling us it's the relics of Mary Magdalene physically? Is he telling us it's a body of documents? Is he telling us that it's buried under Roslin Chapel? Is he telling us that it was dug up and moved and placed under the new Louvre Museum in Paris? It's a very inconsistent story that Dan Brown encourages us to contemplate, but really doesn't provide any answers. He's gone to the heart of the origins of Christianity at a time when this is a subject that people are very curious about. He's woven in the question of the role of women in the history of Christianity, in the history of the church, in the history of religiosity and spirituality. He's taken the theme of the new search in the 21st century for spiritual meaning and the meaning of life and layered that in. The Holy Grail, in my mind, is a metaphor. It's what we make of it.
Next this afternoon, the drama and deadly danger of a vicious shootout as SWAT team officers attempt to rescue dozens being held hostage by 4 heavily armed criminals in a bar.